All right, well, let's get started. My name is Claire Sadar, and I am the program manager here at Historic New England, and I want to welcome you to this webinar tonight, Loud, Naked in Three Colors, the History of Tattooing in Boston. Before we get to introducing our speakers tonight, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about how you can interact with us here in the webinar. There are closed captions available, and you should be able to turn those off and on with either the More selection in your toolbar or the captioning button. It really just depends on where what kind of system you're using. We do encourage you to ask questions. If you have questions, please add them to the Q&A function. The Q&A function as opposed to the chat, because the Q&A function allows us to manage the questions a little bit better. If you do have comments or problems or anything else, you can put those in the chat. So if you are not familiar with Historic New England, we are the largest, oldest regional preservation organization in the country. And we want to welcome you here tonight to this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Lorna Condon, who is going to introduce our speakers and tell you a little bit more about them. Thank you, and enjoy the program, Lorna.
Thank you, Claire. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lorna Condon. I'm the Senior Curator of the Library and Archives at Historic New England, and it is my treat this evening to introduce our speakers to you. I know you will enjoy this program about the history of tattooing in Boston. Margaret Hodges is a writer, historian, and professional genealogist working in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She has collaborated with Derin Bray on several projects and publications, and is the author of works of both fiction and nonfiction. Derin Bray is an art and antique dealer and an independent scholar, also based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Derin has published widely on the early craftsmanship, folk art of New England, and is a leading collector of historic tattoo material. He's a graduate of Yale University and holds an MA from the University of Delaware's Winter Tour program in early American culture. In 2015, Derin's book, Bucket Town, Wooden Ware and Wooden Toys of Hingham, Massachusetts, 1635 to 1945, was named a Historic New England Honor Book in our book prize series. In 2020, Derin won the Historic New England Prize for collecting works on paper for his collection of tattoo material. So it is my pleasure to introduce both Peggy and Derin to you, and I know you'll enjoy the next 45 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna, for that really nice introduction. Margaret and I are really happy to be here tonight to share with everyone our latest project, Loud, Naked, and in Three Colors. It is the first history of tattooing in Boston, told through the lens of this remarkable family, a father and three sons, who controlled the tattoo scene in the city for most of the first half of the 20th century. And what you're about to see is really a small sampling of the material we've turned up over the last 7 or so years. And so if you'd like to learn more about this topic, I'd encourage you to check out the book, because it goes a lot more in depth, and you can find it at rakehouse.com. Our story begins here. Some of you probably recognize this. This is Scully Square. When of course it no longer exists, Scully Square was raised in the early 1960s or throughout the 1960s under the guise of urban renewal, and ultimately replaced with Government Center. But for decades, it was the city's gritty, gaudy entertainment district. This is where you'd find the dive bars, flop houses, strip joints, arcades, shooting galleries, and tattoo shops. This photograph dates to about 1948, or dates precisely to 1948, and the stars that you see on the screen mark the location of the 4 shops owned by the Liberty Men during this year. So you can see they literally had the market cornered, but they weren't the only game in town. There were other tattoo artists who would sort of drift into Boston. They might stay for a few months or a few years, but none of them stuck around like the Liberties did.
Ed Liberty was the patriarch of the Liberty family. And his story actually doesn't begin in Boston. It begins in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is an old factory city about 30 miles north of Boston. He was the son of French-Canadian immigrants who were attracted to the textile mills and other factories in Lowell in the late 19th century. And that was when his family came over. Surprisingly, though, his family did not seem to tie their fortunes to the mills or the factories themselves necessarily. They were very interested in establishing businesses to support their neighborhood. And you see this pattern in both the mother and the sons. The mother was a very headstrong and entrepreneurial person. She established a grocery store that survived for decades and was a critical financial backstop for the family. Edward himself, once he became an adult, he worked as a machinist, a locksmith, an electrician. He was kind of a jack of all trades. And this was still in the Lowell area. The Lowell neighborhood where they lived was sort of a mini Scully Square. It was right where all the trains and the trolley lines came together. And it really did very much mirror Scully Square, in that it was sort of the entertainment district where you could, things were pretty risque down there and you could get into some trouble. And so that was the atmosphere that Ed was familiar with. That was sort of home to him. So Edward and his brothers continued the family pattern of establishing little neighborhood businesses of their own. And these tended to be very low overhead operations. Some of them were very seasonal. And he and his brothers both engaged in these kinds of businesses. They established bowling alleys and pool halls, shooting galleries, and what were called store shows, where a vacant storefront would be rented very inexpensively in the carnival off season, and small exotic animals and performers who were out of work would come and work out of the little storefront shop. And very often there would be a tattooed performer or possibly even a tattoo artist working in that little storefront. And they also, again, the kind of seasonal work that they would do, they would have traveling shows of various kinds that they could take around to the local carnivals, like animal shows, dog shows and monkeys, things like that. Very low overhead, very transient kinds of operations. And what you see here is a shooting gallery target from Edward Liberty's, one of his very first little business operations, which was a shooting gallery. And we like to juxtapose this with one of his very, very early tattooing business cards, because he told the story that he actually picked up tattooing because of that shooting gallery, because apparently there was a tattoo artist who was working in the shooting gallery, but he had a tendency to not pay his rent. And one time he just decided to skip out on his rent. He blew town, left his kit behind. And Edward claimed that that was how he began tattooing, was with that kit. So he establishes himself as a tattoo artist. He's working in Lowell, still doing his odd jobs, but he goes into Boston occasionally and tattoos. And again, he has no fixed place of work. He works out of arcades. He shares shop space with other tattoo artists. And so he enters into and finds himself on the periphery of the Boston tattoo scene.
Right, and in addition to, so he really sort of starts to learn the craft of tattooing in the mid-1910s in Lowell, and he's bouncing around from shop to shop, tattooing out of arcades, like Margaret mentioned, also tattooing at carnivals. This is one of the great photographs that surfaced during our research. It shows Ed tattooing beneath a tent, probably at a carnival or fair. The resolution on this is so high that we can really zoom in and take a close look at what's behind him, which is this magnificent wall of hand-painted tattoo designs with today known as flash or flash art. And we can see the dates on the flash are like 1921, 1922, and a lot of them are signed by him, E.W. Liberty. And here's a just sort of a close-up of some of those sheets of flash. The Liberty family didn't throw away much, and we're fortunate because of that, but this group of flash is still unaccounted for. We don't know where it is or if it even survives. But what does survive is sort of his second set of flash. It dates to about a decade later. So this is a sheet painted in the early to mid 1930s, and it's sort of typical of what hung in his shop at that time period. The designs range from Japanese to patriotic to religious, and sort of everything in between could be found on the shop walls, hundreds of designs to choose from. The interesting thing about this set, and there are about a dozen pieces that go along with this particular sheet, is that it might have been painted by his wife. We're not sure. We're not exactly sure, but we know that she was an amateur artist. She spent a lot of time in the tattoo shop. She may have actually done some tattooing there herself, although that hasn't been firmly documented yet. But according to family tradition, she would sit in the shop and paint some of the flash that Ed used. So it's entirely possible that we're looking at Lena Liberty's flash, not Ed Liberty's. But in either case, this is the artwork that hung on the walls of his tattoo shop in Boston. And we know that because we can match it up with photographs that survive. These are just two more examples of sheets from that same time period that Ed Liberty used. You can't really get a sense for the scale, but these are much larger than the designs you just looked at. They're about 2 or 3 times larger, and they were intended to be chest pieces or tattooed on someone's stomach. And these patriotic motifs with spread-wing eagles and flags and shields and banners were very popular at the time, and were popular way before Ed Liberty started tattooing, and have continued to be popular right up until today. So he just starts to get his footing tattooing in Boston, finally out of shops, when the city announces sort of the original Big Dig, this major excavation construction project to widen the streets. And it cuts right through Scully Square and really disrupts the businesses. And Ed sees the writing on the wall, as do some other tattoo artists in the city, and he decides he's not going to stick around. He's going to go somewhere else to tattoo while the construction is going on. And we know that because it's because of the physical evidence and the written evidence and some other things that we're going to show you in just a little bit. But this is a wonderful letter that survives still in the Liberty family that was written by a very famous Detroit tattoo artist named Percy Waters. He writes to Ed Liberty in 1923, clearly in response to a letter that Ed had sent him asking, is there a good place for me to tattoo in Detroit? And Percy Waters sort of gives him a lukewarm response. You know, there's a joint here that you can tattoo from, is basically what he says. It's, you know, good in the summer, slow in the winter. But Ed does not go to Detroit. Instead, he travels to the West Coast. And for a couple of reasons, we think. He stops in a few different places. Bellingham, Washington, which is where his estranged father was living and had been living since the 1880s. We're pretty sure that they were in contact with each other during that time. He goes to Seattle for several months. And he also lands in Los Angeles for a stretch. And at every one of these spots, he's meeting with tattoo artists. He's working alongside them, networking. Undoubtedly, they're trading, you know, exchanging trade secrets, sharing designs, talking about, you know, machines, all this sort of information that you can't get anywhere else. And so it turns out to be a really formative period in his career. And so when he returns to the East Coast in 1924, he brings back with him this collection of West Coast tattoo material. There's a lot of it. The best by far is this little book of designs. It's a real treasure. It was painted by a very famous tattoo artist named Ben Corday. Ben Corday is considered one of the most influential tattooers of the early 20th century. He was hands down the best flash painter of that time period, and his artwork was really just a cut above everyone else's. But he's also tattooing right on South Main Street in Los Angeles, which is where most of the tattoo artists in that city were located. And that's where Ed Liberty was hanging out when he passed through Los Angeles. He was undoubtedly tattooing there. We know he met some of the other tattoo artists working on that block. Presumably he met Ben Corday. He would have been difficult to miss. Ben Corday was nearly 7 feet tall. And so when he wasn't tattooing, he would often moonlight as an actor, taking bit parts and, you know, the movies when they called for a giant, and also did some theater stuff as well. And so this comes back to Boston with Ed, in addition to some other West Coast material that he gathered up from other artists that he had met out there. And here, it's such a beautiful example of early American flash art that we wanted to show a few more designs. And the designs in this book range from grotesque to Japanese to very naturalistic. And of course, some of them touch on popular culture. And one of my favorites is this design for John Sullivan, the famous Boston boxer. We think this is a memorial design, probably painted at the time of Sullivan's death in 1918.
As Derin mentioned, Ed Liberty does return to Boston. And at this point, we have to kind of pause for a minute and just kind of set the scene for you with what was going on in Boston while he was gone, and also even earlier than that. What we have here is an image of the famous very early tattooed couple from Boston, Frank and Annie Howard. And Frank Howard ended up figuring strongly in Ed's career, both early on and also later after he returned from the West. It's almost certain that Ed encountered Frank in his early days in Boston when he was still traveling back and forth from Boston and from Lowell into Boston. But just to give you a little background on Frank Howard and what made him so amazing is that he and his wife decided to get tattooed from head to foot in the early to mid 1880s, and then began careers as tattooed performers. They would exhibit themselves, and he was by far the reigning and certainly the oldest tattoo artist on Scully Square once he settled down. But first he and his wife were traveling around with carnivals and circuses, and finally they were picked up by Barnum and Bailey, which was a huge coup. And they ended up traveling the world with the Barnum and Bailey circus as Barnum and Bailey's original tattooed man, and he traveled also. When he returned, he spun that fame into a career as a celebrated tattoo artist, the owner of one of the largest tattoo shops on the East Coast, right on Scully Square, and he also sold tattoo supplies via mail order.
That's right, and this is an example of one of his price lists. This dates to 1905, 1910s, right around there. And he opens up that Scully Square tattoo shop in 1905 and partners with another Boston tattoo artist in the supply business. And they are producing everything that a tattoo artist would need. power supplies, machines, needles, inks, pigments, stencils, photographs to hang up on the wall, and designs, hand-painted sheets of tattoo flash, much like the ones we looked at earlier, and also small books of designs. And this is one of Frank Howard's small books, design books that he sold through his supply company. This is the cover of it. And this particular one was owned by Ed Liberty and descended through his collection. And so the designs in this book are more traditional American, what we consider traditional American tattoo imagery. And it's a lot of, eagles, anchors, flags, memorial stuff, occupational designs. But these are, I'm sure to most of the people watching this presentation, these are familiar images because these are the same images that you see on popular prints, ceramics, even textiles and other decorative arts, including what's one of the more well-known tattoo designs, which you see on the left here, which is the Sailor's Farewell. And so Frank Howard is selling these through his supply business, and it's one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest tattoo supply companies in the country, and it plays a big role in helping to sort of professionalize tattooing and get the equipment into the hands of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to find it.
And here's an image, actually, which is collections of historic New England, and it's one of our all-time favorite, wonderful, amazing images. Here is Frank Howard's tattoo shop on Scully Square in 1913. And you can see just from the way the sides of the building are painted, and there's tons of signage all over the place. You can see Frank Howard's showmanship and ballyhoo, and you can see that he is obviously appealing to everyone possible. He advertises that his shop, people in his shop speak any number of languages. He's selling, he does society, he's selling kits, he's doing society emblems. He's possibly teaching or at least offering how-to manuals. He's selling oil and watercolor paintings by a man named James Fraser, who tattooed with Howard for a short time. So you can really get a feel for this amazing load that existed there on Scully Square, that Frank Howard was the proprietor of. Ed Liberty returns to Boston 1924 or so, very, very shortly before Frank Howard dies in 1925. And we don't know how it happened, but Frank Howard, Ed Liberty managed to move into Frank Howard's space on Scully Square. And not only did he then have access to this magnificent landmark place for people wanting tattoos, but he also acquired a great deal of Frank Howard's memorabilia. We suspect that it was material that was left behind in the shop after it was cleaned out by the family. So he took possession of what was a spectacular accumulation of tattoo flash, photographs, and remnants of Howard's supply business. And we know this because much of this material has come down through the Liberty collection, through the Liberty family. And that's how we know about it.
Right. Yeah, this relationship bears out in the material evidence. So there's all this wonderful, incredibly rare Frank Howard material that passed down through Ed Liberty's collection. And it's some of the earliest documented American tattoo flash, certainly earliest Boston documented, professional tattoo material, and some of the highlights include just really wonderful paintings by Frank Howard. This is a demon head, sort of a Japanese-inspired design. It's relatively small, about 7 by 9 inches, painted on paper. Also it has like this sort of varnish on it to protect the design. I don't know if you can pick that up on your screen or not. And it's one of the few pieces of signed Frank Howard flash that we know about. And it's one of the reasons, this and a few others in the Liberty collection, that we're able to attribute, identify and attribute other tattoo flash to Frank Howard. And because of his supply company, there's, I won't say a lot of it, but there are other examples of it that have been, spread out. They're all over the country, all over the world now. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are these massive pieces of tattoo flash painted on like linen window shades. These would have been painted right when he moved into Boston and opened up that shop. And they are, the one on the left, or the one you see here anyway, has this wonderful patriotic design at the top. Sort of crudely inscribed in that banner is the name of his partnership, Smith and Howard. And then it sits above all these wonderful Japanese designs. It's one of several of these, or few of these, window shades that are known to survive. These are, for the time period, these are sort of masterpieces of early tattoo flash. Material from the turn of the century is very difficult to come by.
So Ed has reestablished himself in Boston, and over the next few years, he asserts himself as Boston's preeminent tattoo artist. And we see him here in about 1929, tattooing a man named Cassius Church, who was an ex-Navy man and possibly an aspiring sideshow attraction. And I want to show the next one. There we go. And here he is in all of his glory, or at least all of the glory that is safe to show. And it certainly was Edward Liberty's magnum opus. He was very proud of it. He covered him from neck to ankle. And Cassius is actually a great example of the full gamut of design sources that tattoo artists availed themselves of. His front features a patriotic eagle and flags. You can't see them, but reportedly there are comic strip characters, period comic strip characters tattooed on him. There are the lucky horseshoes, very, very typical popular symbols. And then, the girly portraits, the flapper girls and flowers and so forth. But his back was the real tour de force, the pièce de la résistance. This was actually an interpretation done by Ed Liberty of a 19th century religious genre painting of the mother and child, the Madonna and child. And Ed Liberty boasted that the entire piece contains 37 angels. Oh, Derin, you want to talk about the photo postcards and how they were used?
Oh, sure. So these are photo postcards, what are called real photo postcards by collectors. And they're sort of an important part of, you have to understand these to understand some aspect of tattoo history, because most tattoo artists from this time period, when they would tattoo someone as heavily as this and the work was noteworthy, they would send them to the arcade or the whatever local photo studio was nearby, and they would produce these photo postcards of their work, which the tattoo artists would then share or sell from their shops. They would share them with their colleagues. And then the expectation was that the person who had been tattooed, presumably tattooed for exhibition, would take them on the road and sell them as souvenirs. And all the while sort of, advertising the skill of whatever tattoo artists, in this instance, at Liberty. This is actually the only person we know of that he fully covered. And so he really gets settled in Boston during this time period, post Frank Howard, late 1920s, early 1930s. Meanwhile, back in Lowell, his 3 sons are being raised by their grandparents, and they've also taken up the family business. And so they start tattooing, the Liberty Boys start tattooing in the early 1920s, some of them, as far as we know, and become proficient a few years later. And by 1930, Dad invites the oldest son, Frank, into Boston. But one of the sons, the second son, Ted, his name was Edward, shared a name with him. And so to avoid confusion, because there were going to be multiple Liberty men tattooing in Boston now, Ed takes on the nickname Dad. So from here on out, from basically 1930 forward, he's no longer Ed Liberty or E.W. Liberty. He's Dad, Dad Liberty, Dad's tattooing studio, Dad's tattooing shop. And it's used on all of his signs, his business cards, other trade paper that he created. And this, again, one of the sort of great sort of fortunes of the Liberty, for tattoo historians and tattoo enthusiasts, is that the Liberty family saved so much of this material that most people would have discarded long ago. And so we have several examples of early tattoo shop signs that were used on Scully Square. This is one of the more interesting ones. It's double-sided, it's large, it's about 4 feet wide, and of course, brightly colored. And they needed signage like this because for the most part, the Liberties opted for like really low rent shop spaces, down in basements, on second floors, up, cramped rooms on second floors, up rickety old stairs. So they needed this sort of thing to get people's attention and get them into the studio, because they weren't always that easy to find.
So here's a picture of Frank Liberty, Ed Liberty's oldest son. As Derin said, he had been tattooing in Lowell and came to Boston probably around 1930, the very early years of 1930, and began working with his father. And once he kind of got his feet under him, he opened his own shop, just within yards of his dad's shop. Well, we have here, the photo of him is from him in later life, probably about 1948, during a CBS interview for a popular radio show. And here's a business card for Frank Liberty. And if you're very sharp-eyed, you may notice that this card is the same block print that was used for one of the early business cards for his dad that we showed. And Frank very cleverly recut the block so that it read FW Liberty instead of EW Liberty. Another thing that's very interesting about this this business card is the advertisement for tattoo removal. This was a big business, particularly after the war, after the Second World War, when many of the sailors who had gotten tattoos kind of regretted it. And actually, this is where and this is the gentleman who coined the phrase "loud, naked, and in 3 colors." When he was talking about regretful sailors and soldiers coming in to have their tattoos removed, he claimed that he had thought that they would all be back to have them removed when they were having them tattooed on themselves, loud, naked, and in 3 colors. The tattoo removal process was expensive. It was actually more expensive than getting a tattoo, and it used extremely medieval technique that basically consisted of using a tattoo machine to tattoo under the skin caustic materials like tannins and silver nitrate. And after tattooing that under the surface of the skin, then they would slather more of it onto the surface of the skin, onto the tattoo itself, and wrap the arm for a couple of days so it could just kind of fester. And a big nasty scab would develop. And there was always a great risk of infection. And they would use materials like Spanish fly and vinegar and alum in these unbelievable concoctions.
About a dozen sheets of flash art survive that we know were owned and used by Frank. He dies in 1956, I think. And as far as we can tell, his work effects are they go inherited by his father, by dad, and then they get sort of parsed out to the other sons, and they pass down through those lines. But this is one of the more interesting sheets that we know he used. And we know he used them because, again, some of the pieces from this set can be seen in photographs of the inside of Frank Liberty's shop. So this is a large design meant to be, again, a chess piece or even tattooed on his stomach. There is a really great photograph of a man with this design tattooed on his stomach. And it was inspired by the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco, the Panama Pacific Exposition. And so there were other tattoo artists who had variations of this design hanging in their shops all over the country. And we believe that this is also the first set of tattoo flash that Frank owned, because several of the pieces in this group, or one of the pieces in this group, is dated 1930. And that's basically the exact year that he parts ways with Dad, because he'd been tattooing in Dad's shop for about a year when he first moved to Boston, and then sets up his own business across the street.
And very shortly after Frank joined his dad in Boston, youngest son Ted also came into Boston and began working with his father and brother. Ted was by far the most troubled of the three Liberty brothers. He maintained a running feud with his family throughout the decades, and often was at odds with his business partners. He indulged in some petty crime. The earliest we know is that when he was actually in Lowell, he stole a car and joyrode it with friends down to Baltimore and abandoned it. So he did end up moving around an awful lot. He would have fallings out with his family, and he would leave. And one of the places that he ended up in was Portland, Maine. And this was in the mid to late 1930s. And at one point when he was in Portland, he and some accomplices robbed a grocery store, a store that was just a few steps from Ted's shop. And of course they were caught and charged. And he actually did 2 years in the Maine State Prison in Thomaston. When he got out, he continued to bounce around between Lowell and Boston and Portland. And it seems like he had a major falling out with his family in the early 1950s. And he blew town and went down to Baltimore and set himself up in Baltimore as a tattooer. And the sign that we see here was one that he had done for himself in Baltimore. And it was painted by a local sign painter and cartoonist named Eddie Levin. And Ted continued to move around. He grew increasingly erratic and difficult to work with. He eventually ended up in Canada and finished out his career in Vancouver. And this is one of the signs, you can see it in situ there in Vancouver. It's likely that the sign itself predated Vancouver, because you can see multiple nail marks in the sign, which suggests that it was moved and reused repeatedly.
Right, and the photograph, the snapshot on the right dates to like the mid 1960s. So Ted bounced around a lot. When he first got to Canada, he basically moved his way across the country, moving from one failed partnership to the next. He always wore out his welcome. But when he landed in Vancouver, it's the one place where he found some stability, and he stayed there, tattooed there for about a decade. And we're lucky because the contents of his shop were saved, and they inform a lot of what we know about the Liberty family today. And so the last of the Liberty boys was Harold. He wasn't the youngest, though. He was the middle child. And unlike his brothers, he didn't take up the tattoo business. He sort of deliberately, strategically went the other direction. He moved to upstate New York. He got a job at a General Motors factory, and he climbed the ladder there for many years and became a foreman of a factory. It was a lucrative business, a lucrative job for him. By all accounts, he was doing well there. During the war, though, the factory got converted and was producing bodies for bomber planes. And while this is happening, he's sort of hearing from his brothers and dad in Boston, who are, on one hand, Harold is, his pay is frozen. Meanwhile, in Boston, his father and dad and brothers are making money hand over fist, tattooing sailors and soldiers. It's by many people considered to be like the golden era of tattooing, and they make a small fortune. And so after the war, he leaves New York, he moves to Boston, and at, I think, the age of 40, he learns to tattoo. So his dad teaches him to tattoo, and they work together for about a year, and then he opens his own shop in Scully Square. It's the shop that people who are still living, it's the shop that they remember. It was directly above the Tasty, that sort of landmark greasy spoon that people seem to remember fondly. And he stayed there until 1962, which is when tattooing was banned in Massachusetts. Both of these photographs date to 1957. And this is his earliest tattoo flash. So this was painted in 1946, the year he moves to Boston, and the year he's working with his father, learning the tattoo trade. These designs, because so much of his father's tattoo flash survives, we're pretty confident that he basically was copying the designs that he saw hanging in his dad's shop. One of the sort of interesting anecdotes that cropped up while we were doing our research was, well, we interviewed a gentleman who had been tattooed by Harold, who, by the way, went by the nickname Lefty. And he was tattooed by Lefty in 1963. This fellow had not seen this sheet of tattoo flash in probably 50 years. And actually, I don't think I had even seen this sheet of tattoo flash at that point in our conversation, but he told me everything he could remember about going into the shop, and he'd spent quite a bit of time there. And he recalled one sheet of tattoo flash that had a big snake on it, a cobra, and he described this sheet perfectly. And he said it was the most, this cobra design was the most expensive design that Lefty offered. It was $45, and which even for then, that seems like quite a bit of money for this particular design. But we know from sort of a couple different newspaper articles reporting on Lefty's shop that he did not like to tattoo bigger designs. He preferred the smaller ones. And so, as I mentioned a little while ago, things start to slow down in Scully Square. I think in 55 or 57, when those photographs were taken that we just looked at, they increased the age to be tattooed. And then 1962, they outright banned tattooing in Massachusetts. And that's also when the city takes over Scully Square. And over a period of months, they evict all of its residents and all of the business owners. And so he gets kicked out. He no longer has a tattoo home, packs up his bags. He moves across the border to New Hampshire, where tattooing is still legal, an hour north of Boston. And he opens a shop in Salem along an industrial highway. And he moves into a house right there, and he tattoos right out of the front porch. And so this is where he works from for the next decade until he retires. We know from his journal, or his day book, which includes these sort of journal entries every so often, that he was really nervous when he was forced to leave Boston because he didn't think his clients were going to follow him to New Hampshire, but they did. And before long, he made more money in New Hampshire than he had ever made in Boston. And so he retires around 1973, and that essentially ends the Liberty family's 50, 60-year reign on tattooing in Boston and New England. And that's the end of our story, but there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more to look at. So if you're interested in, you should grab the book. There's over 160 illustrations of flash art, vernacular photographs, graphic ephemera, things that haven't seen the light of day in some cases more than 100 years.
Well, thank you so much, Peggy and Derin. That was really fascinating talk. Again, if anyone has any questions, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A function, and I will relay those on. So you end with Massachusetts banning tattooing, which is really, really interesting. Why did they ban tattooing? Was there an underground tattooing business, and when did they legalize it again?
Well, it wasn't just happening in Massachusetts. Tattooing was banned other places. Most famously, it was banned in New York City, I think the year before, maybe 1961. And so certainly some of it did go underground. The reason for it is a little bit open to debate. They claimed that it was that the risk of infection and spreading disease, and that people were getting ill because of it. But there's actually, I think, no factual evidence to support that claim. But it also got folded into this sort of idea of urban renewal and cleaning up, quote unquote, what we're seeing as sort of the seedier parts of town.
I think along with that, the idea of urban renewal and of improving areas that did not look good. I also think that banning tattooing was sort of a reaction to the post-war growth of the American middle class and the kind of conformity that was expected among middle class people, and also the Cold War also kind of put pressure on people to conform, and I think that led to a governmental tightening, trying to control the more unruly aspects of popular culture.
So kind of on that, going back to the beginning, I was curious about who were the kinds of people pre-war that were getting tattooed. We think of the stereotype of the sailor getting tattooed, and of course, that was in part true, but you see in the one image in the beginning with that, the big panel of flash, there's a woman there getting tattooed. And that's not something, which is a stereotype of who was getting tattooed in the early 20th century. So what kind of culture sprang up around it, and what professions other than people in the military, or what other maybe ethnicities were interested in getting tattooed?
Right. So we should have probably explained that photograph a little bit better. So he's tattooing, or he's pretending to tattoo the face of a woman in order to sort of advertise cosmetic tattooing, which was something a lot of tattoo artists from that time period would do, or at least would claim that they did. I don't know how popular it actually was. It may have been more of a sort of just a sales gimmick. But in terms of who was getting tattooed, it was everyone. It was everyone. And of course, had a lot of military sailors, certainly the Charlestown Navy Yard right there, but it was all walks of life. And you can see that through both the artwork. Frank Howard's Flash is a great example. So he's painting up these little travel book design books in the very early 1900s, And yes, it's a lot of military-based designs, but also there's stuff for butchers, tailors, baseball themed. There's like a wide range of occupations that that the designs cater to. And the other great thing that we have is we have this stack of consent forms for people who wanted to get tattoos removed. So you can kind of sort of work backwards from that. And a lot of them, it's a lot of men, but it's well, a lot of women as well, just having tattoos removed that they regretted. And the great thing about those records is that we find out the names of the people, which could be fake. We don't know if they use their real names, but what we can rely on is it describes what the tattoo is and how much it costs to remove it, and then the year that it happened. So we do have these sort of little pockets of material that we can look to sort of tell us like who was getting this work done.
I think that you know, the prevalence of women appearing, getting tattooed or being shown as tattooed was a part of the tattoo artist's marketing strategy and had been for decades, you know, into the later 19th century. A very large and very important part of the tattoo trade was the spectacle of tattoo. And just like you see Ed Liberty demonstrating tattooing at the carnival, that was a big part of pulling business into your tattoo shop, was the people being able to actually watch it being done. And what would be more thrilling and slightly prurient than to see a woman being tattooed or to see a tattooed woman.
And there is a tattooed woman from this time, from the very early 1900s, who's actually from Portsmouth, where Peggy and I live. She goes into Boston in like 1901 and gets tattooed at a competitor's tattoo shop. It wasn't Frank Howard's, and apparently it was done in front of a large display window, so people could actually watch the process.
Interesting. So someone has a question about Frank Howard as Professor Frank Howard, how he advertised himself. So where did he assume that title and why?
Well, it's prevalent in the tattoo world that tattoo artists would take on, first of all, needle names. His real name isn't Frank Howard, it's Frank Packard. And, but Frank Howard Packard. He goes by Frank Howard. And Professor was used by dozens of other tattoo artists at the same time period. On one hand, I think it's supposed to, in a way, kind of like give him credibility or just make him seem a little bit more professional. But also these titles like this were generally popular among sort of a full range of like circus, sideshow, vaudeville performers. So I'm sure people knew he wasn't a professor. But Ed Liberty and a couple of his sons also went by professor at various points in their career as well. But you'll see professor and doctor a lot, or doc.
Interesting. Someone wants to know about tattooers from Worcester, Springfield, Lawrence, or Providence, if you've done any research into those areas.
Right. Well, we have done some. There are some like lesser known tattoo artists working in Worcester and Lawrence. And actually there's one tattoo artist named, sorry, his name's blanking, Walter Cleveland, who, the person who asked that question, I have a feeling might be a tattoo artist because it's so specific, but Walter Cleveland is known today for some machines that he created in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He actually tattooed here in Portsmouth, where Peggy and I live, for one summer, but he also tattooed out of a barber shop in Lawrence briefly, back in like the late teens. So we've come across tattoo artists working in those areas, but it's really the big cities. Providence, there's a lot happening in Providence. And there's Boston tattoo artists who go into Providence and to Newport, and they know each other. And there's some instances where like letters survive between the Boston tattoo artists and the Rhode Island tattoo artists. So it was in some ways like a pretty tight-knit community.
Mm-hmm. Someone else mentioned Salem too.
Right.
Where's there a big community of tattooers there because of the,
Right.
Navy sailor connection?
Right. There was definitely tattooing there. But not like Scully Square or like Boston, like what was happening in Boston. I haven't actually come across too much from Salem. But if there's a port nearby, there was a tattoo artist working there at some point, whether they had a permanent shop or they were just passing through seasonally or chasing the fleet or following the ships. They would have been there at some point.
So someone wants to know about the descendants of this family and how do they regard their family's involvement with tattooing, and perhaps have any of them become tattoo artists themselves?
Yeah. I think that they were surprised to learn how interested Margaret and I were in their family. And, they were very proud of them, but didn't perhaps quite realize just how important or how big the contribution was that the Liberties had made to tattooing, certainly here in Boston. I'm not sure if that answered the question or not, but was there another part to that question?
So just, how were they react to, their family's history? Are they proud of it? Or, or are any of them involved in tattooing still?
They're definitely proud of it, as they should be, because what the Liberty Men accomplished was impressive. Tattooing was highly competitive, and to stake out a piece of real estate that big and that important and to sort of keep the competition at bay was no small feat. But some of the descendants, shortly after the book came out, a couple of them, and actually I'm just hearing, I heard recently that several more, they're picking designs from the sheets and they're getting them tattooed.
Oh, so, cool.
Yeah, it's sort of a way to kind of honor that past.
Wow, that's very interesting.
There's also a great grandson who is heavily tattooed, I think.
Yes, right? Yes, yeah.
So someone would like to know if during this time period, the early 20th century, was it common, or do we know of members of the elite, the aristocracy, Brahmins getting tattooed, or is that something they really avoided and it was more of the common people's thing?
That was it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, why don't you take it, Derin? Go ahead.
Well, it happened. It was a thing. There were sort of Boston socialites getting tattooed. There are a couple of articles, newspaper articles. Sometimes those articles are sensationalized, so you have to sort of sift through to find what the nugget of truth may be. But going back a little bit earlier, and Peggy can probably talk to this, there are examples of prominent Bostonians getting tattooed.
Yeah, when Japan opened up to the West in the second half of the 19th century, it was quite a badge of honor and quite an accomplishment, and considered enviable to travel to Japan and have the leisure time and the money to get enormous, elaborate, and absolutely gorgeous hand tattooed designs. And many wealthy Bostoners and leisured men and who knows, probably some women too, did get tattooed in Japan. And undoubtedly that continued in the United States as well. Later. And I see that there's a fellow here in the question Q&A who mentions a relative, ancestor of his who went to Harvard and got tattooed when he was in Boston. And that was also very common, that the Harvard societies and the Ivy League schools, the fraternity brothers and so forth would get tattoos. And also a lot of the benevolent societies, the Odd Fellow Men, you know, the Knights of Columbus, the Masons, they also would often get their society emblem tattooed on them.
So one question that's been asked several times is, how did you guys get interested in this topic of tattoos, and I guess specifically the history of this Liberty family in Boston?
Well,
I blame it on Derin, so Derin, you.
Sure. I have always been interested in sideshow history since I was 13 or 14 years old, and in circus history, but then professionally, you know, I ended up pursuing, you know, early studying, researching, writing about curating exhibitions related to early American furniture and folk art, and then just sort of slowly over time, those two things overlapped. And I was really interested in researching some of the other performers who traveled with circuses and sideshows and performed at dime museums. But I kept on coming back to tattoo artists or tattoo performers, because they were like the one act that after the show was over, they would step off the stage, and then it's like the work really began, because they would tattoo whoever showed up at the show, whoever the spectators were. They'd go behind the tent and tattoo them, and that's where they made their real money. And of course, I'm personally attracted to the sort of folk art aspect of it. A lot of this is like self-taught, or, you know, the instruction that they received was pretty loose. So the artwork it ranges from, some of it, like the Ben Corday flash we looked at, is incredibly fine. And then some of it is extremely crude. But it's all, you know, that sort of range of quality and design has always sort of interested me.
And I've always had an interest in subcultures and groups of people who have been overlooked in history, and you know, kind of bringing them back into the story of American history. And I think that that's one of the things that I find so wonderful and challenging and fascinating about researching tattoo history, is that you know, these folk were often quite transient. They moved around a lot, either because they were performing or trying to find work, or you know, they were living hand to mouth, and they were not able to settle. They did not have permanent homes. So finding records for them is a real challenge, and is wonderfully interesting. And you always find the most amazing stuff. These people were extraordinary. You think about the Liberty family, you know, they managed to keep their families fed and together through 2 world wars and the crashes in tattoo business between those 2 wars. They found ways to do it. They were incredibly entrepreneurial. They were creative. They hung together, and they made it. And I think that, you know, that aspect of working class 20th century American culture, I think is sometimes overlooked. But in a lot of ways, they were pretty amazing people.
And so in this book, Derin, it seems like I know that you have an extensive collection. Does a lot of this come from your collection personally?
A few things. So the Liberty collection is a little bit scattered. So the family thankfully held on to a big chunk of it, and you know, these are now like family heirlooms to them, safely guarded. But Ted Liberty's collection, you know, traveled throughout Canada. Most of it ended up going to a tattoo artist in San Francisco, but a lot of it got, you know, a lot of it fell off the truck before it made it to San Francisco. So there's some of Ted's stuff is in a museum in Amsterdam right now. And it's just all over, and in private collections in Canada and all over the place. But as for the things I own, there's some things that had, you know, some of these things that had just made their way out of the Liberty collection many decades ago. And I had an opportunity to buy a few of those things. So like that small book of tattoo flash painted by Frank Howard was something owned by the Liberties that I was lucky to acquire. But I don't, there are only a handful of things from them that I own.
Well, I encourage everyone to pick up the book. The design and the images are just amazing. And I want to thank you both for taking the time to talk about this really fascinating story of, as you said, a marginalized piece of Boston history. So I will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who signed up for this program with a link to the recording of the program. And you can also send me feedback via that email if you have any additional feedback for us. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time tonight to come out, and we hope to see you at another Historic New England program soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Good night.